Pro-Moscow rebels fighting in Ukraine said they would comply with a request from the Kremlin and open up a humanitarian corridor to allow the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops they have encircled. United Nations said that the number of registered Syrian refugees has surpassed 3 million. And the Islamic State group releases a new beheading video warning US-backed Kurdish militants fighting them in Iraq. Good afternoon, I'm Shachar Peled. You're watching i24 News. We start with a crisis in Ukraine, where, according to the United Nations, more than 2,500 people have died thus far in the conflict. Pro-Moscow rebels fighting in Ukraine said on Friday they would comply with a request from the Kremlin and open up a humanitarian corridor to allow the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops they have encircled. Meanwhile, Russian President Putin says Ukrainian operations in the country's east are reminiscent of Nazi siege of Leningrad during World War II, saying Russians and Ukrainians are, quote, practically one people. And NATO has accused Russia of a, quote, blatant violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and engaging in direct military operations to support pro-Russian rebels. This comes as the UN says the deaths in the fighting between Ukraine and pro-Russian rebels has increased by 300%. Here's more from our i24 News desk.
The United Nations says the death toll in Ukraine fighting has increased by nearly 300%, reaching 2,593 deaths, with only more violence seemingly on its way between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian rebels.
That number has gone up to 2,593 as of 27 of August, which is an average of 36 people killed per day.
Russian military movement along the Ukrainian border and the military weaponry Russia is believed to be providing for the rebels has left many lawmakers in Ukraine desperate for support.
The government of Ukraine would ask Parliament to consider the law of abandoning Ukraine's non-aligned status and reintroducing Ukraine's course towards becoming a member of NATO.
Russian President Vladimir Putin blamed the Ukrainian military for the crisis, comparing operations against the rebels in the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk as reminiscent of the Nazi siege of Leningrad during World War II.
Small towns and big cities are besieged by the Ukrainian army, which is directly shelling living quarters with the aim to destroy infrastructure, which suppress the spirit of those who fight against them. You know, even though it is very sad, it reminds me of the events of World War II, when Nazi German occupiers, fascist German troops, laid siege on our cities, for instance Leningrad. You are from St. Petersburg, right? So they laid siege to our cities, to Leningrad, and were directly shelling cities, killing the residents.
U.S. President Barack Obama continues to stress that sanctions over Russia have been effective in isolating the country, but whether or not it will put a halt to Russian actions is a different story altogether.
And now to Syria, where the UN says more than 3 million Syrians have fled the civil war as refugees, with the highest concentration fleeing to Lebanon, Turkey and Jordan. With Islamist groups creating additional havoc within Syria and elsewhere in the region, the fate of these refugees remains uncertain. i24 News reporter Danny Swibel has more.
According to the UNHCR, almost half of all Syrians have now been forced to abandon their homes and flee for their lives, as this Syrian operation has now become the largest in UNHCR's history. The brutal civil war that has raged since 2011 has resulted in 3 million refugees, with the number surely to rise. A further 6.5 million are displaced within Syria. Over half of those uprooted are children. In a brief to the United Nations Security Council, the UN Office for Humanitarian Affairs reports that the unabated conflict and rise of extremist groups has created a harrowing situation for Syrian civilians.
Each day results in more lives lost and more families and communities destroyed. The rise of extremist groups with complete disregard for even the most basic norms of humanity threatens what remains of secularism and tolerance in Syria. Now more than ever before, the Council must do all it can to end the conflict and ensure that humanitarian access increases so that we can reach all those who are desperate in need in Syria.
As the suffering in Syria drags on for its people, Al-Qaeda's Syria wing, Nusra Front, and other Islamist fighters like IS have begun to spread and were engaged in fighting with forces loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, close to the line dividing Syria from the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights on Thursday, a day after they took control of a nearby border crossing. While the region is consumed by violence on all sides, the Syrian people hang in the balance, not knowing when or if they will ever be able to return to their homes again.
Now to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Despite the heavy toll incurred during the 50-day operation, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has hailed what he described as an outstanding military achievement. His comments come as the premier continues to face fierce opposition to the ceasefire deal, including from numerous members of his own security cabinet. Meanwhile, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas has confirmed that the ceasefire deal is no different from the original proposal made by Egypt at the beginning of the conflict. While criticizing the Hamas decision not to accept the agreement then and instead opt for battle, Abbas also directed rage at Israel, saying the government in Jerusalem would not escape punishment for its, quote, crimes and massacres against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And British Prime Minister David Cameron said today he planned to introduce new legislation to make it harder for Britons to travel to Syria and Iraq to fight alongside Islamist extremists. Cameron, who said he would detail his plans in Parliament on Monday to confiscate passports, was speaking as Britain raised its international terrorism threat level to severe, its second highest level.
We need a tough, intelligent, patient and comprehensive approach to defeat the terrorist threat at its source. Tough in that we need a firm security response, whether that is action to go after the terrorists, international cooperation on intelligence, and counter-terrorism or uncompromising measures against terrorists here at home.
And staying with the Islamic State, for the second time in less than 2 weeks, the Islamic State radical group released a new video showing the beheading of a Kurdish man in Iraq as a warning to Kurds fighting the group in the country. The video, entitled "A Message in Blood," shows first a group of captured men believed to be Kurdish fighters in orange jumpsuits sitting in front of an ISIS flag, and then a man kneeling on the floor in front of a mosque moments before he is beheaded. The IS fighters warn others will face the same fate should Kurdish leaders choose to continue an alliance with the US. And in Iraq, hundreds of people demonstrated Thursday in Erbil, capital of Iraq's autonomous Kurdistan region, to condemn the forced displacement of Iraqi Christians and call for their protection from the Islamic State militant group who has swept across Iraq and Syria. Here's more from our i24 news reporter Danny Swibel.
Muslims, Christians, displaced people, and political parties took part in the protest outside UN offices in Erbil, some 350 kilometers north of Baghdad, in support of the thousands of Christians and other minorities that have fled the northern city of Mosul and other areas after a jihadist onslaught led by IS insurgents swept swaths of Iraq's north and west last month. Mosul's new jihadist masters last week ordered the hundreds of Christian families living in Mosul to convert to Islam, pay tribute, or leave the city, prompting thousands to flee. Those who failed to comply were threatened with execution, and the property of those who left the city were forfeited to the Islamic State.
They were told that they must either pay a special tax, or they must convert to Islam, or they must leave Mosul. The jihadists stole their wedding rings. The Christians were left leaving behind their papers, property, deeds. The Christians left with nothing, leaving behind their papers and property deeds. They left only with what they were carrying.
The protesters handed a letter to the UN, which included a demand that Iraq compensate displaced people and legislate to ban the sale or trade of property and goods seized from fleeing minorities.
We present you with our demands. In answer to the catastrophe and humanitarian suffering our Christian sons are confronted with.
As U.S. President Barack Obama admits he doesn't have a strategy yet in regards to confronting Islamic State militants in Syria and searches for regional partners to combat the growing threat he says puts all the countries in the region at risk, the minorities of Iraq wait in limbo, facing an uncertain and dangerous future.
That's all for now. You can join us again in 20 minutes for our next news bulletin in 3 languages, in English, French and Arabic. You can also find us on our website i24news.tv, where you can find our magazine shows and our news editions. And also comment and follow us on our Facebook and Twitter pages. See you again in 20 minutes. Thank you for watching.